it down. So, Mr. Speaker, the town of Truro lies within the constituency that I'm proud to represent in this House. Truro boasts numerous buildings, many of them private family homes, that possess unique cultural heritage, from the architectural perspective to the historical, from the way in which they were built to the historical importance of those who previously owned them. And, Mr. Speaker, I will continue to use Truro as an example of the need for this government to adopt the proposed amendments to the Heritage Property Act, because Truro possesses so many buildings of cultural and architectural importance that I think that it will be very important to recognize some of these, including the John L. Doggett House, which is the farmhouse my family lives in, right in the centre of town. It was built in 1839. It's a provincially registered property, and, Mr. Speaker, it is a very beautiful house, and I'm very proud to have been brought up.
Order, please. We've reached the moment of interruption. We'll come back to the honourable member in a few minutes. But under Rule 5.5, we've come to the late debate period. I'll read the resolution. Therefore, it be resolved, the House of Assembly acknowledge that the NDP government has allowed Nova Scotia Power to increase rates on the backs of consumers, create a less competitive business environment as a result, and coupled with their electricity tax will continue increasing in the coming years, have made life less affordable for Nova Scotians. And I'll recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise during tonight's late debate to discuss this issue. You know, Mr. Speaker, one only needs to look at the fact that the Nova Scotia Power rate is once again increasing for the 6th time in 9 years. We now have a guarantee that it will increase in each of the next 2 years at least, which of course means that it will have risen 8 times in 11 years. Now, Mr. Speaker, when the current government makes much ado about 2 issues. In particular, one, they make much ado about taking the HST off of electricity, residential electricity. Let's be very clear on that. It was always a flow through for businesses, so that has no impact when we talk about competitiveness, which is what this Mr. Speaker, this motion is largely about the issue of competitiveness and how the power rate increases affect competitiveness. Well, removing the HST from electricity is irrelevant to businesses, first of all, because it's a flow-through, second of all, because it wasn't taken off for them anyways. And, Mr. Speaker, so they have seen the full force of those rate increases at the same time that the rates are being decreased in Prince Edward Island and frozen in New Brunswick. Mr. Speaker, moreover, just 3 days before the election, the Premier's Chief of Staff wrote a letter to the Utility and Review Board, and the Premier put out a press release arguing against adding a demand-side management charge to bills. Yet in the very first session, Mr. Speaker, of this government, they put that tax back on. That tax, it was started last January 1st. It will now double this coming January 1st, and an application has been made to almost double that again for January 1st, 2012. So, Mr. Speaker, as much as the government may wish to talk about taking the HST off electricity, in fact, by 2012, they will have almost entirely wiped that out by a tax they promised not to add, yet have added. So that was not part of the HST promise, Mr. Speaker. Part of the HST will remove it, but will actually add another tax that will add up to the same. That wasn't part of the deal. That wasn't what they promised to consumers. In fact, they promised the opposite. They promised that they would not charge that tax, that they were opposed to it. Just 3 days before the election, Mr. Speaker, 3 days. You know, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that when the Premier was in opposition, he demanded that the government do things to reduce power rates. Now, the second issue that the Premier has talked about, and we heard him in question period today, was the issue of mercury regulations and so forth, and how he noted that his government had made the decision to relax mercury regulations. Well, isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting, Mr. Speaker, that when the Premier was asked by the media at the time how much that would impact power rates, he didn't know. So the decision was made The decision was made before there was any way of knowing what that impact would be. And the Premier admitted that himself in the media at the time. And in fact, you know, as Mr. Speaker, as you're aware, I was an intervener in the recent rate hearings, and it turned out that the impact of the reductions in mercury was very, very small. And in fact, evidence was presented at the board, before the board, that showed that the savings now will actually be made, will actually still be charged to consumers later on and be charged at a higher rate because of increasing costs to do that equipment later on. So over the long run, over a period of about 10 years, consumers will actually pay more as a result of those changes to mercury than they would have otherwise. And that was in evidence supplied by a number of the interveners at the hearing. And other options for reducing the rates were presented. Now, isn't it interesting that the Premier and his government, when they were in opposition, argued that the government should act to reduce the overhead costs and so forth for Nova Scotia Power and order those to be reduced. And yet, here we have, over the past few days, the Premier ordering or demanding that school boards reduce their administrative costs, but he has backed off the demand for Nova Scotia Power to do the same thing. How's that fair? Where is that demand? Where is that standing up for consumers? And so, you know, Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important that we recognize that. We also have seen over the past few weeks the Speaker, Mr. Speaker, the Premier backtrack on a number of things that were reported in the media. He had talked about renewable energy issues such as tidal and so forth actually reducing power rates. Well, we know that they may stabilize rates in the long run, but in fact, they will not reduce it. In fact, we now know from information supplied by Nalcor, which is of course a partner to this deal on the Churchill Falls deal, that the anticipated rate in 2010 dollars for the energy that will come across will be around 16 cents per kilowatt hour. In 2010 dollars, which is much higher than the rate that we're paying now. So let's not pretend that that's a cost saving. Is it a good project? Is it good? Sure, it's a good project. It's a good idea. But let's not pretend that that's going to be some great savings when, in fact, the rate that's projected in 2010 dollars is 16 cents, and that's from the partners of this deal, when in fact we're paying, of course, much less than that now. Mr. Speaker, likewise, and it's 10 years off anyways. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Energy repeatedly noted that in reports, as well as consultants noted in reports, that in fact, if you really wish to use renewable energy to moderate prices and you really wish to do things, then you create competition in the marketplace only for renewable energy suppliers, only for renewable energy suppliers. And by doing that, and I say not only consultants, but the Energy Department's own report suggested the government do this, that they allow renewable energy producers to sell directly to consumers, which creates competition in the marketplace. And isn't it interesting that, you know, the building that our caucus office is in is powered by Bullfrog Power, but they have to buy their power from New Brunswick because in Nova Scotia, you're not allowed to have renewable energy suppliers sell directly to consumers. And so the project investments that they have to make are in places like Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick. And so there are many. Ecology Action Centre, I believe, is also powered by Bullfrog Power and has the same issue. It's a way to start changing the landscape, and it's something that even Nova Scotia Power has indicated that they would not oppose. So, Mr. Speaker, when we look at the issue of competitiveness and power rates, which is what this is about, you can't get up like the Premier did today in question period and talk about taking HST off, because that wasn't done for businesses. That was done for residences. So that doesn't have anything to do with how power rates affect businesses. The mercury issue, as I said, it was shown in the hearing that in fact, in the long run, and not that long, in the years before the Newfoundland hydro issue comes to pass, we'll actually end up paying more as a result than they would now. And because we know mercury is bioaccumulative in the environment, you actually, even though you're reducing mercury more later on, you will still have so much mercury built up in the environment that unlike some other toxins, it doesn't actually dissipate and disappear. And I think that's dangerous, and it was a dangerous decision. So, Mr. Speaker, it's all about, you know, what's affordable, and it's about competitiveness, and that's why the issue of affordability and business competitiveness link together intrinsically. we need to have a business climate that invites and welcomes and makes cost competitiveness the decision to locate a business here. Unfortunately, our two neighboring provinces and arguably our nearest competitors at this time for those businesses are doing things. Prince Edward Island is financing their power company's debt at a lower interest rate, and that lower interest rate is passed directly to consumers. That savings, if done in Nova Scotia, would be more than the HST increase and would apply to every single electricity customer in Nova Scotia. Businesses, industrial, residential, all of them. And it would have an immediate effect because it's required by law to be a pass-through cost. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that the government look at things that address the competitiveness issue around power rates and not just what we see in terms of taxes that get removed and then just added under another name. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member. I'll now recognize the honourable member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's certainly an honour to rise today, and certainly an honour today to stand and rise before my colleagues and discuss this very important resolution that states, therefore, be it resolved, the House of Assembly acknowledge that the NDP government has allowed Nova Scotia Power to increase rates on the backs of consumers, created a less competitive business environment as a result. Now, you know, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, no one on any side of the House wants to see power rates going up. But we take exception to the information that was actually in the resolution, Mr. Speaker, because, quite frankly, it's wrong, Mr. Speaker. And we would all like to see the very opposite happening for consumers right across the province, for families that are affected by this. But at this time, Mr. Speaker, that's not the reality that we live in. But you know, Mr. Speaker, we haven't seen any other government have a plan in place like this government, Mr. Speaker. Our government has outlined a plan that will put Nova Scotia, ensure that Nova Scotia moves forward on its stable electricity rates. And Mr. Speaker, we saw that announcement with our Premier and the former Premier now of Newfoundland and Labrador, Danny Williams, who has signed a deal for Nova Scotians, not only for the people of Nova Scotia, but also for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. Mr. Speaker, the steps that we've taken will put this province, and it has put this province as a leader not only in Canada but around the world. But Mr. Speaker, we cannot just simply remove our reliance on fossil fuels overnight. The opposition thinks we can, but Mr. Speaker, the reality is that we cannot. Until we achieve a more diversified energy supply, Mr. Speaker, in Nova Scotia, which includes a significant transformation to renewable energy sources, we are vulnerable. We're vulnerable to market price volatility. But again, Mr. Speaker, the opposition thinks that we can do it overnight, but we can't. I want to make it clear, Mr. Speaker, that it's the Utility and Review Board, an independent body, has decided that Nova Scotia Power is entitled to the increased electricity costs in 2011 to partially cover its fuel costs and enhance energy efficiency initiatives. The price of fossil fuel, Mr. Speaker, is not under our control. The board determined that Nova Scotia Power's increase in 2007 fuel costs are legitimate. The board also determined that the energy efficiency initiatives that Efficiency Nova Scotia is implementing is a low-cost way for Nova Scotia to meet its future electricity supply and emission reduction obligations. As such, Mr. Speaker, the board approved a rate increase to cover those costs. This is not the government saying this, Mr. Speaker. It's not the government's Utility and Review Board. Electricity rates in this province are regulated by that body, Mr. Speaker. The utility outlined its case as a subsequent hearing as did the interveners in this process, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the measures that have been taken in the renewable energy strategy, in the renewable electricity strategy, Mr. Speaker, will ensure that we have stable pricing for the future of Nova Scotia ratepayers. And Mr. Speaker, that's years to come. 35, 40 years. That's my children and possibly even my grandchildren that will benefit from that. And Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to stand here on the government side, taking the leadership and the vision that's needed. Those other two parties didn't have a vision. I didn't hear them talking about a plan because they don't have one. That's the leadership that this government, this NDP government, has taken to ensure stable pricing into the future for all Nova Scotia families. Mr. Speaker, it will also create economic growth. An example of that plan, Mr. Speaker, that was reached from our province and Newfoundland and Labrador will ensure that there are thousands of jobs in Nova Scotia that are created. This deal will provide Nova Scotia with stable price electricity over 35 years and reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. Now, Mr. Speaker, that's what Nova Scotians wanted. Nova Scotians wanted leadership, and we did it. They can talk all they want over there, Mr. Speaker. They can do it all they want, but they don't have a plan. They don't have a plan. They don't have a plan. You know, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that the Chronicle Herald also acknowledged that today that hydroelectricity from Newfoundland may be Nova Scotia's best chance into the future to rid ourselves of the fuel adjustment related electricity increases. Mr. Speaker, that's a positive move forward. Because in the future, Mr. Speaker, we probably won't see those sorts of fuel adjustment increases. Because we've made the targets, they're hard targets, and we are a leader in renewable energy right in this country. This is one of the reasons why our government, Mr. Speaker, has worked with Newfoundland and Labrador over the past year to see the project being developed. And Mr. Speaker, it's a testament when the now Premier of Newfoundland said that without the leadership of this government, this deal wouldn't have happened. She said it herself, Mr. Speaker, and I truly, truly believe it. That government was in power, that party over there, the third party, was in power for 10 years. In the most recent government was in power for 10 years, and Mr. Speaker, they didn't do anything. Not one thing. And this government has, and we will ensure that that we move this province forward. Mr. Speaker, this is one of the reasons why our government has worked closely with Newfoundland and Labrador over the past year to see this project developed. I do want to take the opportunity to remind the House, Mr. Speaker, that residents and families of Nova Scotia, that this government, unlike that party over there, actually took the HST off home electricity costs, Mr. Speaker. We promised it, and the commitment was kept. That is a 10% decrease in the cost of electricity for Nova Scotia families. And Mr. Speaker, when I heard from families that I spoke to on the doorstep during the 2009 campaign, they said to me, Mr. Speaker, they said, that's a great idea. That is a party with a vision for this province, Mr. Speaker, that's putting money back into the pockets of Nova Scotia families. And Mr. Speaker, we made that commitment, and let's be honest, Mr. Speaker, the commitment was kept. You know, Mr. Speaker, the opposition can chastise all they want. You can chastise me all you want, Mr. Speaker, but you know that the Liberal Party, I see that the honourable member from Yarmouth is laughing, but you know, Mr. Speaker, this is not a laughable thing. You know, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order. The honourable member for Hammonds Plains Upper Sackville has the floor.
Consumers and businesses across Nova Scotia, people have told us clearly. They've told us clearly that the rate increases that Nova Scotia Power was expected to recover the costs associated with meeting our mercury targets would be devastating. It would be devastating, Mr. Speaker. We couldn't, in good conscience, enforce the emission targets this year knowing that it would create a financial burden to Nova Scotians. We believe that we made the right decision, Mr. Speaker. Without it, we would have seen the electricity bills go up by another 5 or 6%. And Mr. Speaker, because of the leadership of this Premier and this government, they're not. Mr. Speaker, they could have been 12, 13%, but they're not. We amended the air quality regulations to give Nova Scotia more time to implement technologies that will meet mercury targets in a more affordable way and with less of an impact on electricity rates. Mr. Speaker, we can't, on this side of the House, support this resolution. We have a renewable electricity plan that will give Nova Scotian families electricity price stability over the long term, as well as create jobs and prosperous economy. And Mr. Speaker, those two parties over there, they don't have a plan or a vision.
Thank you, honourable member. I'll now recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you, and I'm pleased to take part in this debate this evening. And I'll tell you, I can't believe that member was able to stand on his feet and deliver that message for 10 minutes and tell a story. I'm going to tell you about the realities of people and their power bills, Mr. Speaker. They walk into my office weekly wondering how they're going to pay their power bill because of rates and rates and rates. They can't afford to live now, and URB steps in and says, oh, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that every time. When has Nova Scotia Power been refused? Well, let's see. They haven't, Mr. Speaker. They haven't, Mr. Speaker, been refused at all. And the Premier's comments today, oh, that's somebody else's problem. He's not going to stand up for the people in this province who get power bills, Mr. Speaker. We have to deal with them as MLAs and try to work a deal with Nova Scotia Power and help them pay their bills and so on and so forth. People got to eat. What was that comment earlier today? Heat or eat. That was from the now Premier's mouth. Heat or eat. It made a difference to him when he was on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker. It did not mean nothing to him today, Mr. Speaker, not a thing. But I'll tell you what he does care about, though, Mr. Speaker, because it's cut and dried here. He cares about the following. Emera reported unaudited consolidated earnings. 2010, near $375 million, Mr. Speaker. The year before, not a bad year either, near $340 million. Well, that's not bad. Let's go to the net. Yeah, that might sound a little steep. Let's go to the net. Take home. $125 million. 2010. But the year's not over, guys. The year's not over. That's only for 3 quarters. $125 million. Taking her home. $84 million last year. And what did they do with the profits? Let's talk about what they do with the profits for just a couple of minutes. Well, here we go. Let's talk about some of the profits. It's not going back into decreasing rates in the province of Nova Scotia and giving Nova Scotians the breaks that they need. No, it's taking more money out of their pockets and nobody like the government willing to stand up and do anything about it. Now, the URB might be arm's length from government, and the now government, who stood on this side of the House and had all the ideas, has no ideas. They're talking about a plan. Yeah, there's a plan. It's an if plan. It's not a done deal. And it's so many years out, people's houses will be gone, their cars will be gone, and whatever else. They won't be able to afford to pay nothing because the power bills will be through the roof, Mr. Speaker. Now, let's talk about some of where this profit's going. It's not going into infrastructure. It's being transferred over to where? That's right, Emera. Parent company. Shareholders. Well, the shareholders, I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. Too bad I only got 10 minutes. Anyway, let's talk about some of the salaries these people take home. Let's talk about the real people in this province. And the real people are struggling to pay the bills. And then we got the CEO of Emera, Nova Scotia Power, Emera, $650 grand a year. I'll bet you he has no problem paying his power bill. He probably gets a cut on his power bill. Rob Bennett, the CEO. Rob Bennett, the CEO of Nova Scotia Power.
Order, please. Order. The honourable member for Hants West has the floor.
Speaker, thank you, Mr. Speaker. CFO, $320 grand. W.D. O'Connor, COO of Nova Scotia Power, $275,000. Now, the people listening to this will be home scratching their head wondering, I can't pay my power bill, I can hardly afford to eat, and here it is cold winter. Those electric heat apartments and so on and so forth, those bills aren't going to get paid. We know them people. They struggle all the way along, Mr. Speaker. And then we have the dear old shareholder. I've never seen an organization set up, I wish I was a shareholder, guaranteed investment, minimum 8% in the last few years, now 9%. Good money, Mr. Speaker. How do we get into that deal? Now, I've harped on this before in committee and different places about what's not being spent. I'll tell you what's not being spent. Every business profitable. We're pro-business. We want to see businesses do well in this province. Nothing wrong with that. Not a thing wrong with that. Nova Scotia Power says, oh, we've invested in the province. Well, they've invested a mere nothing when it comes to infrastructure in this province. They've worked a little bit on poles and a little bit on this and a little bit on that. 18% of the costs are operational. And that operational cost is salaries and infrastructure. 18%. Where's the rest going? Oh, that's right. Profits. Profits and more profits. Unbelievable how much goes into profit. Nothing. You talk about the wind blowing in this province, the power flickers, you're scared to death thinking about it. Mr. Speaker, this is supposed to be a place where we talk about the people. Now, Mr. Speaker, we need to start investing in our people. The government talks a good story. You know what? The Churchill deal is a good deal. I don't take that away, if that comes through. The problem is, that's an if. And how far out? Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. How far out is that? Well, we don't know how far out that is and if it'll ever come through. And again, as the honourable member from Cape Whitton West says, we're only going to get a piece of it. Well, a piece is better than none, and it could be a substantial piece, and we hope that it is. But is that going to mean, Mr. Speaker, lower tax rates for Nova Scotians? No, not likely. I don't know how we'd ever get to a lower power rate. It just doesn't make sense here. It's only been on the increase, up and up and up farther. And here we have increases, and I'm just looking for my piece of paper I had here because I want it to be accurate on my notes. But the increases over the last 5-6 years. Wind. A lot of wind, all right, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking for that document. Here we go. And I'll table this if you like, Mr. Speaker, once I'm done reading. The following Nova Scotia power rate increases over the past 9 years. 2002, 3.1%, 5, 6%, 06, 8, near 9%, 07, 4%, 09, 9.4%, and now we're going to go with 011. Already projected for 11, 5.6%. 2 years away, not even 2 months away, I should say, pardon me, a couple of months away in January. Why is it we're always picking January, first of the year, middle of winter, when people are going to have the highest power rates? Your lights are on more, even if you don't have electric heat, Mr. Speaker. Your lights are on more. You're going to generate more usage of power. It's just a given in the wintertime, and we know that. These increases, they have to stop, Mr. Speaker. The government has to stand up, and they have to say to the URB, okay, we've allowed this to go on long enough. The government talks about leadership. Well, they have shown no leadership when it comes to the people and looking after the people on the issue of Nova Scotia Power and their increases. Now, again, I'm not opposed to any business making a profit. You have to be profitable to survive in this province and in this country and around the world. That's okay. I am against money being transferred out into parent companies and then gone to shareholders. It's one thing, and it's good that shareholders are involved in the company. That's fine too. But a guaranteed investment, where else can you get a guaranteed investment, Mr. Speaker? I don't know of any guaranteed investments. Doesn't matter where you go. There are very few. Even your RSPs and so on today, you're losing money even on your principal. In workplaces today where you take out these pension plans and everything else, principal and all goes. The market crashes, everything goes. The market crashes, doesn't matter. Nova Scotia Power are guaranteed their investment. Who pays for that, Mr. Speaker? You and me and every other Nova Scotian in this province pays, regardless of the situation or the economics, a guaranteed investment to the Nova Scotia Power Corporation and their investors. That's a sweet deal, Mr. Speaker. And maybe it's time the URB took that into consideration. On a serious note, maybe it's time that the government stood up and went to the URB and appealed along with people that are going to the URB and others and critics and so on that are saying, this isn't good enough. It's time for you to take and freeze your salary for a little while, or reduce it when you're making $650 grand a year. That's a bit steep, but that's okay, Mr. Speaker. Those people don't have to worry about it. Those people don't know what it is to be poor, to be hungry. They have no idea what that means. They don't know what it is to be evicted from their apartment and not know where they're going next month to live. They don't know what it is to buy their kids gifts or not have gifts or Christmas dinner. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I have them people come into my office, and I know all these other members in this House have these people coming into their offices who are struggling. All kinds of them coming into their offices who are struggling and wondering what they're going to do to put not only dinner on the table, but maybe, just maybe, a gift for one of their children or all of their children under the tree, if they have a tree. Now, you might think this is a bit extreme, Mr. Speaker. This is the reality in Nova Scotia, and I know you know that. You represent a rural area in this province. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't matter what part you come from. And I'm sure you probably don't have a whole lot of constituents who are making $650,000 a year. I lived and worked in Pictou County for a while. I know your area quite well, Mr. Speaker, and I can tell you there's not too many that earn $650,000 a year in this province, a whole lot less than what are having trouble today with their power bills. We have to take into consideration, Mr. Speaker, again, the fact that power is something that costs. It costs to generate it. We talk about renewables, and everybody knows when you talk about it and you talk about companies like Minas Basin, they know that it's going to take money, the cost of electricity is not going to go down. These investments in wind farms and other types of renewables cost money to get started. Well, perhaps Nova Scotia Power, who is saying, well, you can't sell it anyway unless you sell it through us, should be making a bigger investment than the government and the taxpayer. Mr. Speaker, that's what needs to get done. Some new ideas have to be put forward here to protect Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. That is what it's about. After all, I believe, it's the people in this province and being able to survive. We talk about this program and that program. People need to be able to have power. They need to be able to have affordable power so they can pay their bills and not worry about whether they're going to be in the dark and cold in December, January, February, and so on, Mr. Speaker. I wish I had more time, but with that, I see that my time is up, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to speak to this very important resolution tonight.
Thank you, honourable member, and thanks to all who participated here on the late debate topic. We're going to resume our regular business. We were on second reading of bill number 125, and I'll recognize again the honourable member from Truro Bible Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, Mr. Speaker, I would like to rise to speak on behalf of the vital amendments of the Heritage Property Act. And I would like to continue to use the town of Truro as an example of the need for this government to adopt the proposed amendments. Mr. Speaker, the town of Truro, which lies in the constituency that I am proud to represent in this House, and in fact grew up in, Truro possesses many buildings of both residential and public, of cultural and architectural importance. Queen Anne-style buildings, Greek Revival, Italianate, Second Empire, colonial farmhouses, and many others. Mr. Speaker, the John L. Doggett House is such a farmhouse right in the center of town. It was built in 1839, is both municipally and provincially registered, and Mr. Speaker, it happens to be my parents' home, the home in which I grew up. So, Mr. Speaker, many citizens have told me over the years that it's their favorite house in the town, for many reasons. Partly because of the fact that its first owner, John L. Doggett, was the proprietor of the Doggett Inn on the Common that was later renamed the Prince of Wales Hotel following the Prince's visit in 1860. Another reason is because one of its previous owners, Colonel Hurd, who married into the Doggett family, was responsible for founding the Truro Legion and was its first president, having been a colonel in Kitchener's forces in the Boer War and World War I. But another reason, and especially, is because it was one of the last two colonial farmhouses remaining in this downtown community. Now, Mr. Speaker, throughout the year, it is common to see tourists from across Canada, along with international tourists, standing in front of my mother and father's house, photographing it. Some even venture onto the lawns to get closer in order to photograph the details of the architecture. These tourists do likewise with the many Queen Anne buildings along Queen Street, taking pictures of the impressive streetscape to be found along that street. They photograph the provincially registered First United Church on Prince Street, and they certainly take home with them treasured pictures of an architectural jewel of the town, the glorious provincially registered Normal College. This building, once featured on the $2 stamp, was designed by Halifax architect Henry Bush and opened in 1878 for the training of Nova Scotia's school teachers. And in fact, there's another building built by the same architect, Mr. Speaker, right up here in Halifax across from the Citadel. Sadly, the building of the Normal College now stands empty, awaiting an alternate and viable use. And, Mr. Speaker, I have personally been involved in attempts to try and get something going in that school so that it will have a purpose in the many, many years to come. Many former teachers fondly recall their education and training in that Normal School, and it was previously known, the Normal School, then the Normal College, and many people went through it, including Margaret Atwood's mother, Anne Murray's mother and aunt, and other very famous people. Mr. Speaker, tourists do not photograph the modern building in which my constituency office is located on the corner of the Montreal Bank building. They do not photograph the 2 shopping malls or the motels, valuable to the commercial life of the town though they may be. They do not photograph the intercolonial railway station with its majestic clock tower, or the Colchester Academy in which many older citizens attended school, or the original Presbyterian St. Andrew's Church on Duke Street, or the original Bank of Nova Scotia building on Inglis Street, or the former Emmanuel Baptist Church on Prince Street, or even the small gem of a building, the Irving gas station on the Esplanade, or the famous theatre along the Inglis Place. Mainly, Mr. Speaker, that's because all of these buildings are no longer standing. They're all victims down through the years of the wrecker's ball. So, Mr. Speaker, it's not only tourists with their tourist dollars who appreciate a community's built heritage. Such buildings stir pride in the hearts of the local residents also. The citizens of Lunenburg, for example, Mr. Speaker, are justly proud of the World Heritage designation granted for their unique houses, which feature what is known as the Lunenburg Bump, along with their outstanding school on the hill. It's part of the definition of who they are, Mr. Speaker. The citizens of Maitland also voted to have their village designated as the first heritage district in the province, principally because of its grand houses with their prominent widow's peaks during the village's heyday as an important wooden shipbuilding centre. And likewise, Yarmouth, Mr. Speaker, has a unique heritage district. The citizens of Halifax, Mr. Speaker, are also proud of the many and varied historic buildings of this city, buildings such as the recently saved and moved Charles Morris House, once the offices of Halifax First Surveyor General. Now, Mr. Speaker, many visiting world-recognized experts in the field of the economics of heritage preservation have visited our city here in Halifax, such as Donovan Ripkema and Dr. Anthony Tung, who spent 2 years studying 22 cities of the world, and they came to Halifax and gave some speeches here recently. They were very, very impressed with the architecture of this province. Tung predicted that only those towns and cities that had strict regulation and legislation in place to prevent the demolition of their heritage properties will actually be attractive to cultural tourists of the future who come to see authentic architecture and not reproductions of this. And apparently, tourists who come to see old buildings and the old heritage of places oftentimes spend more money than other regular tourists, they say. One example he offered was the city of Singapore, where massive high-rises replaced many of the small homes of the original settlers who had come from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, bringing with them a fascinating variety of building styles. Well, authorities there soon discovered that tourists were much more interested in the original structures that remained, so councils have now put in place very strict legislation to protect and preserve such buildings. Now, Mr. Speaker, throughout Europe, for example, cities, towns, and villages treasure their built heritage, hundreds of years older than our North American heritage, and they have established very strictly enforced laws to protect and preserve it. Mr. Speaker, our present legislation allows a person to buy a municipally registered property with the intention of eventually demolishing it, only to having to wait 1 year before doing so. Now, this legislation encourages the demise of our stock of built heritage, and extending the time frame to 3 years will be an important factor in helping to prevent such abuses. Mr. Speaker, since our precious built heritage is such a valuable economic asset and it helps to define our sense of place, no provincially registered building should be able to be deregistered at the whim of the owner, as long as detailed information regarding its age, architectural features, and historical significance have been recorded. Thus, Mr. Speaker, further defining the heritage value of a provincially registered property in relation to applications to deregister such a property will now be required by conducting more extensive research. Mr. Speaker, in the past, walls of heritage properties have been demolished, leaving behind merely the facade of the building. And this is not what is required to protect and preserve our built heritage. Substantial alteration means the alteration or removal of a character-defining element of the property, the existing architectural features of the period, for example, specific types of doors, windows, or trim. Now, Mr. Speaker, throughout the province, there are a large number of public buildings, the interiors of which contain beautifully preserved paintings directly on walls, unique decorative mantels, fireplaces, staircases, and such, built by the master craftsmen from a bygone era. Including such interiors of public buildings should be considered in an application to register a property. Many heritage buildings owe some of their attractiveness and their value to their location also and the setting in which they're located: orchards, fields, gardens, and lawns. The Roby Street Cemetery in Truro, for example, contains graves of some of the town's earliest settlers. Some of the African Nova Scotian settlers are there, the planters, for instance, as well. And this is thus worthy of its recent municipal designation. There are also many parks around the province that are important cultural landscapes as well. And the vast and beautiful Victoria Park in Truro has historic significance that includes Joseph Howe's many visits and the featuring of it in his book detailing his travels around Nova Scotia. To preserve such a cultural landscape with provincial registration as a heritage property would prevent future loss of parkland to urban development. And, Mr. Speaker, I am very proud to support the proposed amendments to the Heritage Property Act today presented to this House. Thank you very much.
If I recognize the minister, it will be to close debate on Bill number 125.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and welcome to the chair. I'd like to acknowledge all individuals that spoke on Bill 125 and thank them wholeheartedly for the comments. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to close debate on Bill number 125.
The question is for second reading of Bill 125. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor? Aye. The bill is carried.
Bill number 125, an act to amend Chapter 199 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Heritage Property Act.
Ordered that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Honourable Government Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you now call Bill 126, the Adult Learning Act?
I recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in the House today to move second reading of Bill 126, an act to provide for the Nova Scotia School for Adult Learning and other designated components of adult learning in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, currently all learning systems except adult learning are established in legislation in Nova Scotia. And this government believes it's time for adult learning legislation, so we can continue to build upon the already successful adult learning programs in this province. In September of this year, we released a discussion paper to get input from interested groups and all Nova Scotians to develop the proposed Adult Learning Act. We invited Nova Scotians to submit their thoughts and comments and also held meetings with our adult learning partners across the province. And we appreciate the time Nova Scotians took to respond to our discussion paper, and this input was invaluable in helping us develop this legislation. The Nova Scotia Adult Learning Act will reinforce lifelong learning as a part of our culture in Nova Scotia and will help prepare Nova Scotians not just today, but for tomorrow's workplaces. It also will help them to be more engaged in their communities and with their families. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I recognize the Minister, it will be to close debate on Bill 126.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Minister of Labour and Workforce Development, I'm pleased to move second reading of Bill 126, and move it along to law amendments. Thank you.
The question is for second reading of Bill 126. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor? All those against? The bill is carried.
Bill number 126, an act respecting the Nova Scotia School for Adult Learning and other designated components of adult learning in Nova Scotia.
Ordered that the bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you call Bill 127, the Occupational Health and Safety Act?
I recognize the Minister for Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House today to begin second reading of Bill 127, which would amend the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Mr. Speaker, it's no exaggeration to say that this act touches the lives of every Nova Scotian. It speaks to the heart of something that affects all of us, that you and your loved ones all have the right to come home safe from work each and every day. To that end, Mr. Speaker, these amendments are important as they update references, reflect current practices, and streamline processes. Specifically, these amendments update the legislation by correcting outdated references, clarifying definitions, repealing outdated proclamations, and clarifying the enforcement powers of inspectors appointed under the Act, permitting documents to be submitted electronically, updating processes, including regulation-making authority for training health and safety representatives, and permitting the Minister to delegate designation of an appeal panel from an established pool of panel members. And in addition, Mr. Speaker, these amendments will enhance privacy protections for individuals in situations where other employees are allowed to observe safety monitoring. Mr. Speaker, these amendments were developed in consultation with legal staff, department staff, and reviewed with other key stakeholders such as the Occupational Health and Safety Advisory Council. And indeed, we will continue to work with all our partners to ensure that Nova Scotians have the safest workplaces possible, and that they make it home safe at the end of the day. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I recognize the Minister, it will be to close debate on Bill 127.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to close the second reading debate and ask that this be moved along to law amendments. Thank you.
The question is for second reading of Bill 127. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary minded? The bill is carried.
Bill number 127, an act to amend Chapter 7 of the Acts of 1996, the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you now call Bill 128, the Trade Union Act?
I recognize the Minister for Labour and Workforce Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the House today to move second reading of Bill 128, an act to amend Chapter 475 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Trade Union Act, respecting powers and duties of arbitrators or arbitration boards. Mr. Speaker, these amendments to the Trade Union Act will simplify the legislation and consolidate the powers of grievance arbitrators into one section of the Act. And it is our hope, Mr. Speaker, that an increased understanding of the legislation will help parties move towards resolving their issues more quickly. And we will continue to update and review our legislation to ensure that it reflects the current practices. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
If I recognize the Minister, it is to close debate on Bill number 128.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise now to move second reading and close debate. I look forward to this going forward to law amendments. Thank you.
The question is for second reading of Bill 128. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary minded? The bill is carried.
Bill number 128, an act to amend Chapter 475 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Trade Union Act, respecting powers and duties of arbitrators and arbitration boards.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 88 the Summaries Proceeding Act?
The question before the House is for second reading of Bill 88. All those in favour? Contrary minded? Bill is carried.
Bill number 88, an act to amend Chapter 450 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Summary Proceedings Act.
Ordered that this bill be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm asking for consent of the House to do third reading on the bills that we had brought in from Committee of the Whole today.
Oh, agreed.
Agreed. Okay. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill number 89 for third reading?
I know, just one. Okay. I recognize the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad that I happen to be staying at the House tonight since we have gone to third reading on Bill 89, which is the Personal Health Information Act. And the points that I wanted to raise in particular on this act relate to the amendments that I'd made this afternoon, and I just wanted to make sure that, for the record, that we understood what they were for and why they were before us. And in fact, those amendments were the amendments that were suggested after we received submission from a professor at the University of King's College, journalist professor, who asked us to consider, and asked the House, in fact, in a 5-page letter, to please consider the access to information that the media requires in order to do their work. And I know the minister had looked at this issue as well and certainly had discussed it with her staff, so I realized that it was an informed decision in terms of voting against those amendments today, and that is important, that people have time to consider amendments when they come forward. But those amendments had taken out the areas relating to the Freedom of Information Act, which the professor felt were actually contradictory, that they would in some way diminish our Freedom of Information Act. And in fact, by including all health information in this act, in the Personal Health Information Act, it actually took, as his letter said, a huge body of information out of the information you could ask for under Freedom of Information. And I want to be clear, it isn't information that we're talking about that is personal, that you could say was Diana Whalen's health record, but it would be information that others might use that were in, for research, or in a body of information that might be all the people that had, a particular, maybe everybody who had H1N1, how many were they, where were they, and that sort of thing. And it is possible to say that maybe somebody could deduce that I was one of those people that had a particular affliction or whatever it was they were looking at. But the media feel very strongly, and I have to agree, that they can't be threatened with fines for simply asking for information. And that's the way the Act is written now, that there is an implied section there, and it's not in front of me right now, Mr. Speaker, but just a moment. Maybe it is. Might be nearby. But in the Act, there is a section that says that sort of implies that if you even ask for information, you're breaking the law. So it's not that it certainly would be against the law if you were given that information, if somebody incorrectly gave it, but to even ask would be considered a breach of the law, and therefore a $10,000 fine or a jail term could result. And I think it's important that we look at that kind of concern, that researchers and media and others might want to know about trends in healthcare, about negative impacts. Maybe it's about errors in the medical system. They need to get some general information on adverse effects and on outcomes. And the way the bill is written, the media feel they cannot even ask for some of that information because there's that implied section that says if you could even impute who it was that was affected, then therefore you're breaking the law. And I think it's very important, again, that we look at who suggested that. The professor who brought it to our attention is Fred Valence Jones, and he's written textbooks that are used across the country in the teaching of journalism, and has very high credentials in that area, and had taken the time to go through in great detail to see what areas he felt were going to impede the work of journalists, frankly, in our province. And I wanted to find out, I understood that our bill, this Personal Health Information Act, largely mirrored the Ontario Act. And I don't believe this is an issue in Ontario, so I think these clauses must be different than what was in the Ontario Act. And we felt that by making the amendments that I proposed today, we could take out the portions that are controversial, follow what Mr. Valence Jones has suggested, which would really just be an assurance to the media and to the journalistic community that we will respect their right to seek information, to hold the government and in fact institutions accountable. All of us in the House know how important the media are in terms of being one of the pillars of democracy, in the sense that we all have a balance. And if we didn't, we all need to do our job well. Opposition needs to do their job, so does government, and the media needs to be there to also hold us accountable and to do the investigative reporting that is so important, that sometimes brings issues to our attention that we would otherwise have been completely unaware of, or government might be unaware of. So it's very important that they not have their hands tied. And I don't think I need to remind the members of this House that Joseph Howe was the original defender of freedom of speech for journalists, freedom of the press. He defended that right here in the legislature in a 6-hour trial for treason, right next door in our legislative library, and his portrait hangs right there on the government side of the House. And I think that is a very important connection that we have, and journalists across the country recognize what he did. Often Nova Scotians may not know exactly who he is, but I'm telling you, people that work in journalism certainly do, and they have the highest regard for him. And I believe that we should be looking at any acts that we have before the House that might possibly step on the rights of journalists to do their work and to do it well. I mean, we really do need to encourage an active journalistic core, media that will seek out stories and do that kind of digging. And that's not going to happen if they're in jeopardy of $10,000 fines whenever they ask for information from a health institute or a hospital or a place that provides care. And as we know, this Act covers not just our hospitals, but it covers all of dentists' offices and other health practitioners, doctors' practices as well, anybody that's holding medical information on an individual. And I think we all very much support the move that's within this bill to bring us to a point where personal information is protected. But the one amendment in particular that I had proposed was to have Section 3 be just ended with the fact that we wouldn't release personal health information, and to take out the part that talks about that might possibly be identifying information. So that part we felt could come out completely, because that's where you get into the ambiguity, the area that could in fact intimidate media not to ask the questions that are needed to be asked. And I felt that was very important. The thing with this bill is you can always come back and amend it again. So if you take it out now, try and work with the concerns that have been raised by the journalists and by the professors and see whether or not there is a way around this that could be brought in later. That was really my intent, was to try and take it out for now and let's resolve it so that the wording is not going to, and frankly, I think it's a strong word, but to say intimidate. I think it would intimidate the media and stop them from doing investigative reporting, which is very important to us. So that was the purpose of the amendment today. There were 4 clauses I wanted to have changed. I understand they've been defeated by the government and supported by the opposition, but you know, I felt it was important we look at that. And now that we're here at 3rd reading and it's already gone through law amendments, I should make the point that the submission we received from Fred Valence-Jones arrived after the law amendments process was finished for this bill, and that is because, as is often the case, it's hard for people to know what bills are traveling through the legislature, and he said, unfortunately, he missed the opportunity to come in person, but he did write a very complete report on what he felt was wrong with it and made suggested amendments as well that the Law Amendments Committee, or now the legislature, could consider. At the same time, during the law amendments process, I had the chance to sit in to some of the presenters there. I think it's important to note that on the issue of information being made available, just name and address, being made available to our hospital foundations and our health foundations, like the QE2 Foundation, the IWK, the Cobequid Health Foundation, Dartmouth Hospital Foundation, and every other little hospital and community across the province. They've asked very loud and clear to please have that access to information, name and address only. No personal health information would be included, and also that they would have a protocol for contacting anybody that had been a patient within the health system. That protocol would mean nobody would be contacted within a number of months, so that there would be time for people to recover and be well again. Nobody would be contacted who had either a bad prognosis or had had a bad experience or had lost a loved one. There would be, you know, many checkpoints put in there to make sure that you would only be contacting people who are in the right position to be spoken to. We would be very sensitive to people who would have other issues or had had any bad experience in the hospital or might be sensitive about being contacted. And people could opt out if they chose right off the bat that they did not ever want to hear from their foundation. The reason I'm raising it again, Mr. Speaker, is that the foundations spoke at law amendments, but at the same time, so did our Freedom of Information officer. And I may not be using exactly her right term, I think it's commissioner perhaps, but she spoke as well to the House, and it was interesting because she didn't take a side one way or the other, which is appropriate, but what she did say was she had contacted her counterpart in Ontario, and there has never been a complaint to the Freedom of Information officer in Ontario that related to any information that was given to the foundations. And that is a common practice in Ontario that's allowed by their legislation. It was one of the aspects of the Ontario Act that we didn't choose to follow. But I think it is important for all members to know that there were no complaints registered. And I think that that was a telling comment from our own officer, sort of indicating that we needn't worry. But as I say, she didn't take a position, but I think she was telling us it won't be controversial. It hasn't been a problem in Ontario. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to belabor those points. I think they've been made. I know the minister has been aware of both of them, and I would be happy to hear from other members of the House. Thank you.
I recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, as we get to 3rd reading, it's our last real opportunity to make comments on a bill that's being seen before this House before it moves on for royal assent and becomes the law in this province. Very much the same kind of comments that the member for Halifax Clayton Park just made. The two issues that are still outstanding, and I'm hoping maybe the minister would stand and comment to these issues for a few moments before we send it on to final assent. But the issue of the foundations was a very well-founded one. I know they had a relatively good lobby effort trying to find a way in which to be able to access at the very least, the names and addresses of people who have visited the hospital, and to be cognizant in a way that they would be filtered so that there would be no medical information seen, and they would be done after a certain wait period. Mr. Speaker, what happens now, of course, their concern is there can be opportunities, or not opportunities, but situations where someone who has had a negative access to a hospital system would receive one of the mail-outs that would be received by one of the foundations, whether it be the IWK, the CDHA, the Yarmouth Hospital, the foundation, what have you. Because there's no way, right now there's no screening that happens. And most Nova Scotians would probably surmise, because the foundation shares an office within that hospital, that they already received some of this information. So, Mr. Speaker, I think I think the Act in its current form is a very good Act, one that will protect privacy of patients and allow for the kind of things that we do need to do, especially when it comes to electronic record. But I think we maybe missed an opportunity there. I'm not sure, but I think time will tell. I think it was a $40 million amount of money that's left on the table by not allowing the foundations to have this. But I think the foundations will persevere. They'll find ways in order to raise money. The only final comment quickly on that is, we do ask 25% on any build project, purchase of equipment by those foundations. And maybe it's time to look at that contribution level, because they are getting more and more expensive to buy equipment or to build hospitals, and the 25% is out of reach for many of the foundations in our smaller communities. So I'll leave it there, and maybe the minister can comment on that. The issue of the media or the journalists being able to access information. And Mr. Speaker, the member for Halifax Clayton Park was quite correct. But let's run a situation. Let's run a situation to understand the problem that this really creates. Okay, there's a highway accident, for example. EHS comes in, picks up the person that is injured. That person is brought into the hospital. So of course everybody knows about it because they drove by, they saw the accident, and it becomes a news story. Okay, whether it be here in the metro area or whether it be down in Yarmouth, people tend to be accident watchers, I guess is what you would say, and they want to know what the outcome of that story might be. So the journalist or the media individual will make a number of phone calls. I remember when I was part of the media, there was 2 phone calls I would make when something like that happened. I'd call the RCMP office and I'd call the hospital. There's 2 places I would call. Now, because of the way some of these things are worded and what's been presented to us by Professor Ballenstone, is the issue that it will now make it illegal for thank you, Valence Jones, it would basically make it illegal for that journalist to call the hospital. Because if they ask the question, they're in contravention of the Act. And even worse, Mr. Speaker, that should the person who answers the phone respond in a way providing that information, they are in contravention of the Act and therefore subject to a possible fine. So it's illegal to ask the information. So maybe there's maybe a clarification of how journalists might be able to ascertain some very basic information. I mean, if they do know the name of the person already, are they okay? What kind of situation are they in? These are some very basic questions that we hear every day on our news. And Mr. Speaker, the member for Halifax Clayton Park was also correct in saying we really don't want to impede. They're a very important part of today's government, of today's way of life. So maybe I just ask a question, maybe a clarification. Maybe the doctor has it wrong, but I think with the learned information that he has here, the amount of work that went into his proposal, unfortunately it was too late for law amendments. I'm hoping that maybe the minister has a bit of an answer for that. So as much as I support this bill, there's a couple of little questions left hanging, and I thank the minister for bringing it forward today. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Question before the House is for third reading of Bill 89. All those in favor? Aye. Contrary minded? The bill is carried.
Bill number 89, an act respecting the collection, use, disclosure, and retention of personal health information.
Ordered that the bill do pass. Ordered that the title be read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, call Bill 102, the Tanning Beds Act.
I recognize the member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think the government enjoys it when we do like the bills that are passed. We had a moment of that earlier today on the organ and tissue donation. And I think with the Tanning Beds Act, it's worthwhile noting that this is a positive step for the province of Nova Scotia. It's going to protect young people, especially. This act will now make it impossible for young people to go to tanning beds here in our province. And the age that was chosen was under the age of 19. Which pretty much keeps our high school students in that category. I think that was a very deliberate attempt by the government not to choose 18 as the age which would be allowed, which has been used in some jurisdictions, and the reason being that it is something that is highly publicized and advertised to young people, especially around prom and special events times. And we know the damage is clear. I think what we really need to do is just acknowledge that the government has listened to Doctors Nova Scotia, has looked at the World Health Organization, which clearly said that the tanning beds and the UV rays that are there are carcinogenic. And I think that's pretty clear. And we've had a letter as well just today from the CEO of the Cancer Society, again, supporting this bill and urging members of the legislature to do so. So I think we should acknowledge their hard work as well in bringing the issue forward and urging government to do this. And we become the first province with a standalone bill that relates to restrictions on the use of tanning beds. New Brunswick did have it in another health promotion bill. But again, I think it is important. It was something I was watching and hoping to see some action on. Had not yet brought in a private member's bill, but was looking at it, and I was pleased when we actually were given a briefing on this bill to see that the government was moving on it. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I will spend a couple of moments on this one as well. And I know the member for Cape Breton West did speak for a few moments during committee whole house about it. Mr. Speaker, this is an act that I do support. One that you know, we have to admit that there's still too many opportunities for individuals to make wrong choices and expose themselves to a carcinogenic situation, whether that be smoking, whether that be laying in a tanning bed. And the information that's provided to us by the Canadian Cancer Society and by other health experts is that this is not a safe pastime, I guess is what you would say. But Mr. Speaker, I did listen quite attentively to the presentations that we did receive during law amendments, and it really brought to question again the lack of true dialogue with these business owners during the time. The problem that we had is that and this is what we've heard, and you know, I think maybe we can consider this at another time, and I'll ask the minister this question at some other date. But is there times where doctors ask their patients to go and get tanning done because they need the rays? It's a very relaxing pastime, I guess. Pastime's the wrong word. I've never done it, so I would not know. But I've never done it. I go outside and get the rays that way. And if I remember to put on my SPF 45, I'll remember to put my SPF 45 on. But Mr. Speaker, there are situations, apparently, from the presentations that we received, that doctors send people out. People with psoriasis, people with acute acne. And in some cases, these are kids at the age of 14, 15, 16. And they're saying that they would never do that except for when they were brought in with a parent. The other point, really, that they brought home to us that I question, and I don't really know what the answer is, and again, we're in third reading right now, so ultimately we'll be passing and engrossing this bill in a short period of time. But the issue of a parental sign-off or waiver. But the other options, what are the other options? If you're not able to go to a tanning bed, you've got two other options. One of it is, well, three options really. Buy your own tanning bed and are not followed by anybody else. Go and sit outside when it's nice and sunny outside and burn yourself to a crisp if that's what happens to you. I said three, but I'm only counting two again. So, Mr. Speaker, or actually some, some health clubs have basically these coin-operated tanning beds. So you're not being watched by a tanning professional that's had training, that knows your skin type, to say that you should only be in the tanning bed for 6 minutes. So what you do is you go in and you're in there for a half hour and you're wondering why you're burnt and you're experiencing problems with of course, your skin. So Mr. Speaker, with that, of course, we support the bill. It does raise a couple of questions of maybe future consideration, but I am very happy that our caucus has been supporting this bill on the way through. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise and speak in support of this bill on third reading. The Minister of Health should be commended for bringing this bill forward. It's a welcome bill. It's timely. It's an important bill, and it sets the standard for other jurisdictions. As we know, Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of people dying of cancer more than ever before, and Nova Scotia has the highest rate of skin cancer than anywhere in the world. What this bill does is bring into practice, it responds to the burden of scientific evidence that we have on the connection between UVB and cancer. It's consistent with our harm reduction strategy, just as we have with alcohol and tobacco. Mr. Speaker, people do have the right to engage in some types of harmful activities, but Mr. Speaker, the public and the taxpayer shouldn't bear the obligation for paying for those high-risk strategies. This bill is also consistent with our health protection and promotion objectives, that we do want to produce healthy children because they make for healthy adults. We want to encourage healthy habits to reduce long-term chronic disease. And the bill is consistent with living within our means. We want to reduce our long-term costs. Mr. Speaker, I also want to use this occasion to thank the many people in my constituency who really went out of their way to draw our attention to the challenge posed by tanning beds. Dr. Robert Strang, the Nova Scotia Chief Medical Officer, Cancer Care Nova Scotia, Peter Green, the chair of SunSafe Nova Scotia, and Jane Brooks of Doctors Nova Scotia, among others. So I do want to thank the Minister of Health for bringing this bill forward. We think it is really important, and we're delighted that she has set the standard for the rest of the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question before the House is for third reading of Bill number 102. Are we ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Bill is carried.
Bill number 102, an act to regulate tanning beds.
Ordered that this bill do pass. Ordered that the title be read by the clerk. Ordered that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call Bill number 103, the Motor Vehicle Act?
Question for the House is for third reading of Bill 103. All those in favour? Aye. All those against? Carried.
Bill number 103, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the bill be read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 106, the Handicapped Persons Education Act?
Question for the House is for the passing of Bill 106. All ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The bill is carried.
Bill number 106, an act to amend Chapter 194 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Handicapped Persons Education Act.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the title be read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 108, the Nova Scotia Museum Act?
Question before the House is for Bill 108. All those in favor of the bill? Aye. Opposed? Bill is carried.
Bill number 108, an act to amend Chapter 315 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Nova Scotia Museum Act.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 109, the Weed Control Act?
Question before the House is for reading of Bill 109. We're ready for the question. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Bill is carried.
Bill number 109, an act to amend Chapter 501 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Weed Control Act.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 110, the Animal Protection Act?
Question before the House is for the reading of Bill 110. All those ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. The bill is carried.
Bill number 110, an act to amend Chapter 33 of the Acts of 2008, the Animal Protection Act.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 111, the Motor Vehicle Act?
Question before the House is for reading of Bill 111. All those ready for the question? All those in favor? Contrary minded? Bill is carried.
Bill number 111, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the bill be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, could you please call Bill 112, the Halifax Regional Municipal Charter?
Question before the House is for third reading of Bill 112. Are we ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary minded? The bill is carried.
Bill number 112, an act to amend Chapter 39 of the Acts of 2008, the Halifax Regional Municipality Charter.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 113, the Clothesline Act?
The question before the House is for reading of Bill 113. Are we ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded. The bill is carried.
Bill number 113, an act to prevent prohibitions on the use of clotheslines.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call Bill 114, the Anti-Idling Act?
The question before the House is for third reading on Bill 114. Are we ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary minded? Carried.
Bill number 114, an act to require an anti-idling policy for the Government of Nova Scotia and public passenger vehicles.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call Bill 115, the Public Sector Compensation Disclosure Act?
Question. The question before the House is for third reading of Bill 115. Are we ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary minded? The bill is carried.
Bill number 115, an act respecting the public disclosure of compensation in the public sector.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 118, the Public Interest Disclosure of Wrongdoing Act?
Question before the House is for third reading of Bill 118. Are we ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Bill is carried.
Bill number 118, an act to promote public interest disclosure of wrongdoing.
Order that the bill do passed. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 120, the Condominium Act?
I recognize the member for Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and we certainly would be speaking on this on second reading. We did not get up and speak on the Condominium Act, and I was certainly waiting for an opportunity at third reading. So we could not let that pass today. There is nothing objectionable in this act as it's written. It really is just correcting some of the legislation that went through last year. But what's really important to note, and what I wanted to get up today, and I know the minister is certainly paying attention, there are some huge problems with condominiums, certainly in Metro, and I'm sure in other parts of the province. I have over the years heard from others that have, in my riding, who'd bought condominiums in Liverpool. Was one person who had bought one along the river in Liverpool. Tremendous problems in the closing of those condominiums, in the formation, the time it takes. In the case of the Liverpool one, it was the time that it takes after people have already put their money down and bought it for it to be reverted to an actual condominium corporation. And in the interim, after you've already paid $200,000 or $300,000, you're charged rent every month of $1,500 and $1,600. That's a travesty, Mr. Speaker, and that shouldn't be allowed to happen. There should be something in place that says it's no more than a token amount for some of the common space. You should not be paying rent for your building. I understand they need money similar to their condominium fees to pay, for the common areas, the parking, security, or yard work. But it's ridiculous to charge people rent when they have already put down their money and purchased a big unit. And that period of time can be dragged out to up to a year. And the rules around that, I think, are causing some real problems to people. And that's one of the things that's not been addressed up to this point. And I know I've had the opportunity at a couple of meetings with the Condominium Owners Association of Nova Scotia. They very deliberately chose their name, Mr. Speaker. It's CONS, CONS. And when they formed that organization, they were feeling completely hoodwinked, let down by the public, or by the government, felt that there was no consumer protection at all provided for the situation that they found themselves in. And our province has been a little bit late to the notion of condominium ownership. The first condominium in Nova Scotia was registered in 1978, and it's a group of townhouses in Clayton Park. And for the first, many years, we only had a few condominiums registered. It's only been the last, really less than 10 years that we've begun to see a large number every year getting registered. It's becoming a more popular form of ownership. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, it reflects our aging population and people wanting the comfort and the security that goes along with having a condominium. It allows you to leave and know that a lot of the work is going to be done. There's more help for older people perhaps, or people that are retired and want to travel. So it's become a much more popular form of ownership, and we haven't kept pace in terms of the rules that we have here in our province. I mentioned the rule about having to pay rent, which is you know, certainly a harm to people financially, but what about the harm that's happened to people who've bought buildings that are in really poorly built? I want to say that it's shoddy workmanship, and that's definitely been the case in some instances. The buildings were put up too quickly. They haven't been properly inspected by the city. They have none of the people or none of the organizations and institutions that you would expect to protect you have been there to protect you. And we found that the Atlantic Home Warranty has been useless in terms of helping people. It only covered the first year, and it didn't cover major structural things that went wrong in these buildings. So the warranty system has failed people. The municipal inspections of buildings has failed people. What we found was that the municipalities, in fact, having spoken as well at some of these meetings to the people who do the inspections, they said, in fact, their role is to be a plan checker. They look in their office, roll out the plans for a building, and check off whether it has the right exits and the right width of hallways, and whether or not it has ventilation systems. They kind of go through the whole checklist of what our building code requires, but nobody was going to the site to actually see what was being built. And that is again and again proven to be a complete failure on the part of government in general, municipal and provincial government, because what was built was improperly built, and there's been leaks and huge expenses in terms of fixing some of these buildings. There is one in the Bedford area that the bill was over $1 million in order to fix some of the deficiencies in that building, and it was past the warranty period, so the builder had long gone. A lot of the buildings were being built at although they're companies you might know, but they're built by numbered companies. So they create a numbered company to build that particular condo. And when the building is complete and a year has passed, they can collapse the company. So there's no company that you can go back to legally and get any redress for the problems that you encountered. And as I say, there was the $1 million plus deficiencies that were found in the one building, in the member from Bedford Birch Cove in her area, but there have been many buildings that have been leaking. And I first became directly aware of this in 2006 during the election, when I was knocking on doors in some of those condominiums, and during rainstorm was shown the water that was coming in and where the buckets were. And these are apartments that are condominium units that are $250,000 and more. And you can imagine how people feel let down and just abandoned by the provincial government in terms of consumer protection. And so I know that the government has been well informed of this. The minister at the time was Minister Muir, I believe, and he did meet with some of these disgruntled owners when they formed the organization CONS to raise the issues, to bring them to the attention of the Minister of Service Nova Scotia. And I know that there has been a working group and there have been a lot of recommendations, but we haven't seen it here where the rubber hits the road. We haven't seen legislation changing yet, just little things. You know, small things. One thing was that the deposits that you make when you're buying a condo must be held in trust. And then you can, you know, you wouldn't run the risk of losing that money if the organization that was building it went bankrupt. And that's a good thing, but nobody in Nova Scotia had lost their deposits. That had never happened. So we were anticipating a problem in doing that, and that's not a bad thing. But those weren't the problems that the people that have directly had to pay for all of these deficiencies, for the shoddy workmanship that they encountered, for a lack of protection from the warranty program and the inspectors not finding that these deficiencies in advance. None of those things have been addressed yet. So tonight, as we're passing Bill 20, I have no doubt it will pass, because this one genuinely is a housekeeping item. I mentioned the other day that housekeeping is usually just a little correction. That's what this one is, and we can genuinely call it that. Nothing controversial here in Bill 20. We want to make sure that the last act we passed is right, But what's really important is that we're here in the legislature representing condominiums now, people who bought condominiums in every corner of the province, because they are appearing in small towns and in resort areas and cottage areas. And we all need to be aware that there has to be better protection for that whole myriad of issues. I've hit the big ones. There are other issues as well around governance and so on, a few of which have been touched. But we need to make sure that we have really strong rules to protect people. And before I take my seat, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say that there are many very good builders in the province, and I know there have been some very good projects. And it is important to note that not all of them have been bad, but we need to make sure that every single building that is put up is built to a proper standard. And the deficiencies seem to be, it is in multi-unit buildings, in large multi-unit buildings. What I was told was that the technology and the construction I guess techniques have changed a lot, and we didn't have as much experience with that in our building community as we might have, and some mistakes were made. But I do think that it's important to note that there are many good builders, and I know some new ones have opened recently that I've heard no complaints about. And I know many of the ones that were identified as having some major problems, the owners of those buildings who have a great deal invested in them, they've put all of their home equity into that condominium building, and they stood to be greatly harmed financially if the building is allowed to get a bad reputation or go to rack and ruin. And those owners have had to step up, in some cases with extra charges on them of $30,000 a unit on top of the cost they'd already spent to buy. And that's because they needed to pool that extra money to make the repairs that were needed. One in my area I know had to have a whole wall re-bricked. And as we know, it costs a lot of money per brick to have it redone. The building was only a few years old, but the mortar had not been done at the right season or at the right time of year or weather, and therefore it hadn't set properly. And here were the owners, beyond the time when there was a warranty that they could go back or any protection to go back to the original builder, they had to replace that entire face of the building. Very expensive changes that people had to go through. So, Mr. Speaker, my call tonight is that the government please go back to the staff that are working on this, and you know, let's have some really big substantive changes coming that are going to address these problems on the next Condominium Act bill that we see coming through. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to make an introduction. If you want to look to the West Gallery, we have a visitor tonight, the previous MLA for Halifax Clayton Park, Marianne McGraw. Marianne, glad to see you. Rise and receive the warm welcome to the House.
I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Speaker, if I can get the attention of the opposition parties for sure, because we have a private member's...
Order.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm ahead of myself.
No, I'm ahead of myself. The question... I recognize the member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I did want to take this opportunity to speak about the Condo Act. This is, in fact, a housekeeping bill, and that is fine. But there are still outstanding issues around condominium construction and some real problems with that. And I have to say that I can't hear myself think. There are some real problems. We have had some real problems around condominium construction in this province. Certainly during the last election, the member for Halifax Clayton Park got me together with CONS, which, as she has identified, is Condo Owners of Nova Scotia, and we went through some of those problems. And for people who have bought condominiums in this province to spend, you know, $300,000, in some cases $400,000, and then turn around and discover they are going to be hit with a whopping repair bill, because in essence government has failed them because there was not adequate inspection of their unit when it was being built is in my view, not fair. And a number of improvements have been made to the way that to the legislation surrounding condominiums since problems first came to light. But I do feel that there is one area where we really haven't hit upon, and that is that the people who paid the good money had to turn around, and because the home warranty had expired, and because, as the member for Halifax Clayton Park identified, the company had in fact been collapsed because the proper amount of time had passed, they have no redress. So there are people who have, paid an awful lot of money for a condominium that they thought they would live in for quite a long time without ever having to make repairs, and in fact they turned around and got, whacked with a massive repair bill. And in some cases, as the previous speaker has identified, they put down all this money, and then when they went to move in, well, it wasn't ready yet, or it wasn't registered as a condominium because they had not met the minimum amount of sales. So they end up having to turn around. To add insult to injury, they can't sometimes move in right away, but when they do move in, they have to actually pay rent. So there are still some problems around the Condominium Act, and I do feel that it is incumbent upon us. It's part of our job is to be good stewards of good governors, and to leave this area untouched is a problem in my view. I remember watching a program about builders in Britain, and they had actually this was around home warranties, but they would say, it has to have a certain kind of insulation in the roof, in the ceiling, and so the inspectors would go in, and if they saw a bale of that insulation sitting there, they would say, yeah, it's in, because it's actually in the area. It hadn't been installed. And so there were all kinds of problems resulting because inspections were not properly carried out. So I think that we really need to move on this for the protection of people who buy condominiums. Typically, people who buy condominiums are retired or heading in that direction, and they should not have to spend the golden years of their lives worried about money because we failed to do our jobs. And I would like to note, as the previous speaker has, that there are good builders in this province. There are good developers in this province. We had some problems. It is by no means endemic to all builders, these problems, but I do think that sort of like the SALT II treaty, trust but verify is always a good motto. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat.
The question before the House is for third reading on Bill 120. Are we ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Contrary minded, nay. Bill is carried.
Bill number 120, an act to amend Chapter 85 of the revised statutes 1989, the Condominium Act.
Order that the bill be read, the title as read by the clerk, and that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. With the help of the House, could I please call private members' public bills for third reading? Oh, that's in committee. 1 second. Can we resolve ourselves in the committee of the whole for permission? We'll just agreed. Gordy. Where's he at? I don't know.
So I could ask you to. Order, please. I recognize the clerk.
Mr. Chair, this bill was reported back by the Committee on Private and Local Bills without amendment, and it contains 9 clauses. Shall clause 1 carry?
Shall clause 1 carry?
Carry.
Shall the remaining clauses carry? Shall the title carry? Shall the bill carry? The bill is carried. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, we should now stand and report progress. That down here, like one of.
For the purpose of the record, the bill was Bill number 91. Bill number 91.
The chair of the committee now reports
that the Committee of the Whole has met and considered the following bill, Bill 91, without amendments, and the chairman has been instructed to recommend this bill to the favourable consideration of the House.
I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could you please call private members' public bills for third reading? Bill number 91, the Royal Nova Scotia Yacht Squadron Amalgamation Act.
Question before the House is for third reading of Bill 91. Question, are we ready for the question? All those in favour say aye. Contrary minded? Bill is carried.
Bill number 91, an act to amalgamate the Royal Nova Scotia Yacht Squadron and the Saragway Club.
Order that the bill do pass. Order that the title be as read by the clerk. Order that the bill be engrossed. I recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that concludes the government's business for today. So, Mr. Speaker, this is do ask you now rise to meet at the hours from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And some of the work we'll be doing is bills for third reading, which is Bill 99, Committee of the Whole House on Bills, which is Bill 63, the Legal Professions Act, Bill 100, the Labour Board Act, Bill 105, the Education Act, and Bill 119, the Residential Tendencies Act. Mr. Speaker, I do wish you now rise to meet at the hours from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m.
The motion before the House is for adjournment. All those in favour? Contrary minded, nay. Motion carried. The House will now adjourn. Will now rise to meet again at the hours of 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. tomorrow.